The wind howled across the frozen tundra of Nova Siberia, battering the walls of Research Station 217. Dr. James Harrison stared through the reinforced windows, watching sheets of snow whip past in the darkness. His shift as the station's medical officer wouldn't end for another 6 hours, though emergencies were rare this far from civilization. Most of his work involved treating minor injuries and running routine health checks on the dozen researchers stationed here. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the memories that always seemed to surface during these quiet night shifts. 5 years since he'd left the military medical corps, and still the nightmares of battlefield trauma haunted him. He'd come to this remote outpost hoping the isolation would help him find peace. Instead, the endless white expanse only seemed to amplify his ghosts. The emergency alert system blared to life, startling him from his thoughts. A proximity sensor had detected something moving outside the station's perimeter. In these conditions, it could be anything from local wildlife to a malfunctioning piece of equipment. But protocol demanded investigation. James pulled on his thermal gear and checked his medical kit out of habit. As he stepped into the airlock, the station's AI spoke, "Dr. Harrison, visibility is at 12%. Exercise extreme caution." The bitter cold hit him like a physical blow as he stepped outside. His helmet's enhanced vision systems could barely penetrate the swirling snow. He followed the coordinates on his heads-up display, fighting against the wind with each step. The reading led him to a shallow ravine about 100 meters from the station. At first, he saw nothing but snow and ice. Then a faint luminescence caught his eye, a soft purple glow coming from beneath a drift. James's heart nearly stopped when he brushed away the snow. A woman lay there, but unlike any he'd ever seen. Her skin was opalescent, with delicate patterns that pulsed with bioluminescence. Instead of hair, she had what looked like fine tendrils that shifted color like fiber optic cables. She was clearly alien, and she was dying. Multiple lacerations crossed her body, leaking a phosphorescent fluid that must have been her blood. Her breathing was shallow and erratic. Even through his insulated gloves, he could feel her body temperature dropping rapidly. Station protocols were crystal clear: any alien contact was to be reported immediately. The facility would be locked down, and a special containment team would be dispatched. The alien would be treated as a potential threat until proven otherwise. James knew what would happen then. He'd seen it during his military service: the studies, the tests, the complete disregard for the subject's welfare in the name of scientific advancement. This beautiful being would become nothing more than a specimen. "To hell with protocol," he muttered, activating his emergency beacon. He carefully lifted the alien woman, noting how surprisingly light she was despite being close to human size. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, revealing irises that swirled like nebulae. She made a sound, a musical tone that somehow conveyed both pain and fear. "I've got you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure she could understand. "I'm going to help you." Instead of heading back to the main facility, James carried her to his private medical cabin. The small structure was technically for quarantine cases, but he had modified it over the years into a fully functional clinic where he could work independently. Inside, he gently placed her on the examination table. Her vital signs were unlike anything he'd ever seen, but the medical principles had to be similar: stop the bleeding, prevent shock, maintain temperature. He worked quickly, using a combination of conventional medical techniques and improvised solutions. The wounds themselves were unusual, not cuts or burns, but something that seemed to be disrupting the very structure of her cellular matrix. As he treated each injury, he noticed her body attempting to heal itself, producing intricate crystalline structures that sealed the damages. Hours passed as James worked tirelessly. Gradually, her condition stabilized. The pattern of lights beneath her skin steadied into a gentle rhythm that he hoped indicated normal life signs. Her breathing became deeper and more regular. As dawn approached, she opened her eyes fully for the first time. James found himself frozen in place, captivated by those cosmic eyes. She reached out with one delicate hand and touched his chest, right over his heart. A sensation like an electric current passed between them, and suddenly his mind was filled with images and emotions, her gratitude, her fear, her surprise at finding kindness on this strange world. Zara, the word appeared in his mind, accompanied by an image of herself. Her name. James, he replied, both aloud and in his thoughts. A pounding on the cabin door shattered the moment. Dr. Harrison. This is Security Chief Roberts. We detected unauthorized medical activity. Open up immediately. James looked at Zara, seeing the fear return to her eyes. In that moment, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He had sworn an oath to preserve life, all life. He wouldn't abandon her now. Trust me, he whispered, and began implementing the escape plan he'd created years ago for a very different kind of emergency. As alarms began to blare across the research station, James Harrison prepared to risk everything for a woman who had literally fallen from the stars. James worked swiftly in the dim light of his cabin's emergency systems. Years of paranoia, or preparedness, depending on how you looked at it, had led him to install a hidden compartment beneath the floor panels. Inside was everything needed for a quick escape: survival gear, medical supplies, and most importantly, a stealth skimmer designed for navigating the harsh polar terrain. The pounding on the door grew more insistent. Final warning, Dr. Harrison. We're authorized to breach. Zara stood shakily, her luminescent patterns flickering with anxiety. Through their newfound mental connection, James felt her confusion and determination mingling with his own racing thoughts. He guided her toward the hidden compartment just as the door's hinges began to whine under the assault. Down here, he whispered, helping her into the narrow space. The skimmer was barely big enough for two, but they had no choice. James sealed them inside just as the cabin door burst open above. He heard boots on the floor, angry voices, the crash of equipment being overturned. Through small gaps in the panels, shifting beams of light penetrated as the security team searched. James held his breath, feeling Zara's heart racing where she pressed against him in the confined space. Clear, a voice shouted. But look at these readings, there was definitely something non-human here. Alert command and lock down the perimeter. The voices and footsteps receded. James waited 5 more agonizing minutes before activating the skimmer's silent drive. The floor panels above them slid away automatically, and the vehicle rose on its cushion of gravitational force. The blizzard outside worked in their favor, masking their exit as James guided the skimmer away from the station. His mind raced through options. They needed somewhere to regroup, to treat Zara's remaining injuries, to figure out their next move. The nearest civilian settlement was over 500 kilometers away, but they'd never make it through official checkpoints. Zara's hand touched his arm, and suddenly his mind filled with images: a massive spacecraft crashing through the atmosphere, pieces scattered across the tundra. A small emergency pod, intact but hidden. Emergency supplies, communication equipment, answers. Show me, James said, understanding her intent. Through their mental link, she guided him across the featureless waste, her knowledge combining with his expertise in polar navigation. As they traveled, Zara's strength gradually returned. The crystalline structures that had formed over her wounds continued to spread, creating intricate patterns that seemed to strengthen her body. But with her recovery came increasing anxiety, not for herself, but for others. Through fragments of shared thoughts and emotions, James began to understand. She wasn't just a random crashed alien. She was part of something larger, something that had brought her to Earth deliberately. Her people, the Lumini, were fighting a desperate battle against an aggressive species called the Nexus, who consumed other civilizations' life force to fuel their expansion. Earth was next in their path. The blizzard began to clear as they approached a range of ice-covered hills. Zara directed them to a narrow ravine, barely visible unless you knew where to look. At its end, partially buried in snow and ice, sat a sleek oval pod about the size of a small room. James had just brought the skimmer to a stop when Zara suddenly stiffened. Through their connection, he felt a wave of terror that wasn't her own. Somewhere, other Lumini were crying out in pain and fear. "They're here," she whispered, speaking English for the first time, her voice carrying an ethereal melody even in human language. "The Nexus. They followed me." As if in confirmation, a deep rumbling filled the air. James looked up through the ravine's narrow opening to see massive dark shapes descending through the clouds, ships that seemed to absorb the very light around them. "How did they find us so quickly?" James asked, already moving to conceal their skimmer. "The research station," Zara replied, her patterns pulsing with urgent light. "They have infiltrators everywhere, preparing for invasion. When the station reported my presence." She didn't need to finish. They'd led the Nexus right to her. James pulled survival gear from the skimmer as Zara pressed her hand to her pod's surface. It opened silently, revealing an interior filled with advanced technology. She quickly gathered what looked like weapons and communication devices. "James," she said, turning to face him. "You've already risked too much. This isn't your fight." He met her gaze steadily. "They're planning to invade my planet. Pretty sure that makes it my fight." Through their connection, he felt her gratitude and something else, a warmth that made his heart race. But there was no time to explore these feelings. The Nexus ships were getting closer, their sensors no doubt already sweeping the area. Zara handed him what looked like a sleek rifle. "This responds to bioelectric fields. Just think about firing." She pressed something small and cold into his palm. "And this, if we're captured, use it. Better than letting them take you alive." The implications chilled him, but James pocketed the device. "What's the plan?" "We have to reach the emergency beacon in my main ship's wreckage," she said, checking readings on a holographic display. "It's powerful enough to contact the Lumini defense fleet. But it's 30 kilometers from here, across open terrain. And between us and it? At least one Nexus strike team, probably more. They'll be looking for me, and now you." James checked their supplies and weapons one last time. "Then we'd better not keep them waiting." They emerged from the ravine into bright Arctic sunlight. The Nexus ships hung in the sky like tears in reality, disgorging smaller craft that began systematic search patterns. In the distance, James could see strange figures moving across the snow, humanoid, but wrong somehow, as if they were made of living shadow. Zara's hand found his, their fingers intertwining. For a moment, they stood together, a human and a Lumini, preparing to face an enemy that threatened both their peoples. Through their mental link, no words were needed, only shared determination, trust, and the unspoken understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together. The hunt was on, but this time, the hunted were ready to fight back. The shadow-like Nexus troops moved with unsettling precision across the tundra. James and Zara stayed low, using ice formations and snowdrifts for cover as they made their way toward the main crash site. Their mental link had grown stronger, allowing them to coordinate without words, a significant advantage when sound could betray their position. Through Zara's memories, James now understood more about their enemy. The Nexus weren't just conquerors, they were parasites on a cosmic scale. They drained the life force from entire civilizations, leaving hollow shells of planets in their wake. Their troops were once living beings from other worlds, now corrupted and transformed into perfect soldiers. A patrol passed barely 20 meters from their position. James held his breath, watching the grotesque figures through the scope of his Lumini weapon. They looked almost like negative images of people, human-shaped holes in reality that somehow moved and thought. Their footsteps left patches of frost on the snow, as if they absorbed heat from everything they touched. Zara's hand squeezed his arm in warning. Through their connection, he felt what she had sensed, more patrols converging on their position. They were being herded. "They're pushing us toward something," James whispered. Zara nodded. "The crash site. They know that's where we're heading." A high-pitched whine filled the air as another Nexus ship passed overhead. They pressed themselves deeper into a crevice, Zara's bioluminescent patterns dimming to near darkness. James felt her consciousness brush against his, sharing a plan. The crash site was still 10 kilometers away, but there was a research substation nearby, one of the automated weather monitoring facilities that dotted the tundra. If they could reach it, they might be able to use its communication array to contact someone, anyone who could help. They waited until the ship passed, then moved quickly across the open ground between ice formations. The substation's silver dome gleamed in the distance, a beacon of hope in the white wasteland. They were halfway there when the first shot came. A beam of pure darkness sliced through the air where James's head had been a second earlier. Only Zara's lightning-quick mental warning had saved him. They dove behind a ridge as more shots followed, the strange weapons seeming to tear holes in the light itself. 6 hostiles, Zara communicated mentally. 3 o'clock, staggered formation. James raised his weapon, letting instinct guide him. The rifle responded to his thoughts, firing bursts of concentrated energy that blazed like miniature suns. One blast caught a Nexus soldier directly, and the creature simply unraveled, its shadowy form dissipating like smoke. They fought their way forward, moving in perfect synchronization. Where James's military training ended, Zara's alien abilities began. Her body generated pulses of bioenergy that disrupted the Nexus soldiers' cohesion, making them vulnerable to James's shots. Finally, they reached the substation. James quickly bypassed the security lock. All research facilities used similar systems, and they ducked inside just as another patrol appeared on the horizon. The substation was cold and dark, powered down to minimal functions. James moved to the main console while Zara secured the entrance. His fingers flew across the controls, bringing systems online. "Something's wrong," he muttered. "These systems, they've been modified." Zara joined him at the console, her patterns pulsing with concern. "The infiltrators. They've been preparing for this invasion longer than we realized." Before either could react, lights flooded the station. A familiar voice came over the speakers. "I'm sorry, Dr. Harrison, but I can't let you warn anyone." James's blood ran cold. Dr. Reeves? His former colleague from the research station, a woman he'd worked alongside for 2 years. "The Nexus showed me the truth," Reeves's voice continued. "Humanity is stagnant, wasteful. Under their guidance, we can evolve into something greater." Through the station's windows, they could see Nexus troops approaching from all directions. Reeves had led them right into a trap. "They're lying to you," Zara projected her thoughts, hoping Reeves could somehow understand. "They don't elevate species, they consume them." "You don't understand their vision," Reeves replied. "But you will. Both of you will." The station's internal defenses activated, filling the air with a high-frequency pulse that brought Zara to her knees, her patterns flickering erratically. James caught her before she fell, his mind flooding with her pain through their connection. In that moment of crisis, their mental link deepened beyond anything they'd experienced. James felt Zara's consciousness merge more fully with his own, her knowledge flowing into him. In an instant, he understood how to operate her weapons, how to access her pod's emergency protocols, how to generate the bioenergy fields that were her species' natural defense. His body began to glow faintly, patterns of light appearing beneath his skin like a mirror of Zara's own. The pain from the defense system washed over him too, but together they were strong enough to fight through it. "Emergency Protocol 7, Zara gasped in English. James understood immediately. He raised his rifle, no longer aiming at the approaching troops but at the station's power core. One shot would overload it, creating a massive electromagnetic pulse. It would destroy the station and hopefully disable the Nexus forces, if they could get out in time. He looked at Zara, still struggling against the debilitating pulse. There was no time to explain, no time to plan. Through their connection, he sent a single thought, "Trust me." Her response came instantly, "Always." James fired. The explosion threw them clear of the substation just as its power core went critical. James held Zara tight as they tumbled through the snow, his newly acquired bioenergy field protecting them both from the worst of the impact. Behind them, a massive electromagnetic pulse radiated outward, shorting out the Nexus troops' coherence fields and temporarily disrupting their ship's systems. They didn't waste the opportunity. Still connected mentally, moving as one, they raced across the tundra toward a series of ice caves Zara had detected earlier. The strange patterns under James's skin continued to glow, his transformation apparently permanent, the first human to ever share Lumini biological traits. The sharing of life force, Zara explained as they ran. When you saved me, it changed both of us. They reached the caves just as the Nexus forces began to regroup. Deep inside the icy labyrinth, they found something unexpected, signs of habitation. Recent signs. "We're not alone," James whispered, noting the subtle marks on the walls, the carefully arranged supplies hidden in crevices. A voice emerged from the shadows, "No, you're not." Figures stepped out of hidden alcoves, weapons raised. Some were human, others clearly alien, including several Lumini like Zara. Their leader was a tall woman with military bearing and scars across her face. "Commander Lance," she introduced herself. "Welcome to the Resistance." Over the next few hours, huddled in the warmth of the hidden base, James and Zara learned the truth. Earth had been infiltrated by Nexus agents years ago, but a small group of humans and aliens had discovered their presence and begun fighting back. This base was one of several scattered across the globe, preparing for the invasion they knew was coming. "Your crash wasn't an accident," Lance explained to Zara. "Our agents redirected your ship here when the Nexus attacked it. We needed to make contact with the Lumini leadership." "The beacon in my ship," Zara realized. "It's not just for calling reinforcements, is it?" Lance shook her head. "It contains proof of the Nexus infiltration, and coordinates for all their hidden bases on Earth. If we can activate it, we can expose them before the main invasion begins." But there was a problem. The crash site was now heavily guarded, the beacon unreachable. Unless... The changes in James, one of the Lumini scientists observed, studying the patterns flowing under his skin. "They're not just superficial. His DNA is adapting, incorporating Lumini characteristics. If we could replicate this..." "No," James interrupted. "We're not experimenting on anyone." Zara stepped forward, her pattern synchronizing with James's. "There might be another way. The sharing of life force, it has to be voluntary. But if others were willing..." The implications were staggering. A true merger of human and Lumini abilities could create warriors capable of facing the Nexus on equal terms. But the risks were enormous, and time was running out. Through their mental link, James felt Zara's determination mixing with his own protective instincts. They had started something unprecedented, a bridge between species that could change everything. Lance studied them both. "How long would it take?" "Hours for the initial transformation," the scientist said. "Days for full adaptation. We don't have that kind of time." As if to emphasize the point, the cave walls trembled. Above, Nexus ships were beginning systematic scanning patterns, closing in on their location. "We have to move," Lance ordered. "Our secondary base." "No," James and Zara spoke in unison. Through their connection, they had glimpsed another possibility. "The Nexus ships," James explained. "They're vulnerable to Lumini energy signatures. If we can get close enough, we could hijack one," Zara finished. "Use it to reach the crash site." It was an insane plan. Even with their combined abilities, the chances of success were minimal. But as they looked around at the determined faces of humans and aliens standing together, they knew it was their best hope. Lance considered for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll create a diversion. Give you a chance to reach the nearest ship. But if you fail..." "We won't," Zara said firmly, her hand finding James's. As the Resistance members prepared for battle, James and Zara shared a quiet moment. Their mental link buzzed with unspoken emotions, fear, hope, and something deeper neither dared name yet. "Ready?" James asked, though he already knew her answer. Zara's patterns pulsed in harmony with his own. "Together," she said simply. Above them, the Nexus ships drew closer, their shadow troops preparing for the final assault. But this time, the hunters were about to become the hunted. The real battle for Earth was about to begin. The Nexus ship hung suspended in the Arctic sky like a tear in reality, its dark hull absorbing the aurora borealis that danced overhead. Inside, James and Zara moved silently through corridors that seemed to defy physics, shadows writhing along the walls around them. The ship's interior was a nightmare of non-Euclidean geometry, but their merged consciousness helped them navigate its impossible spaces. Their hijacking plan had worked almost too perfectly. The Resistance's diversion had drawn away most of the shadow troops, leaving the ship lightly guarded. More importantly, the Nexus hadn't anticipated the effect of James and Zara's combined abilities. Their merged bioenergy signatures had confused the ship's security systems, making them appear as corrupted Nexus troops. "The crash site is 3 minutes ahead," James communicated mentally. Through the ship's viewing ports, they could see Zara's wrecked vessel below, now surrounded by Nexus forces. Zara's response carried a mix of determination and worry. "They'll know we're coming. No way to hide a ship this size." "Then we don't hide." James's plan unfolded in their shared consciousness. "We give them exactly what they expect, a Nexus ship making a standard patrol approach." They had learned enough about Nexus protocols from the Resistance to mimic typical behavior patterns. The ship descended smoothly toward the crash site, its shadow field rippling in what appeared to be a routine scan. Below, the Nexus troops continued their work, not suspecting anything amiss. Until the ship's main weapons turned on them. Beams of concentrated darkness lanced out, not at the troops but at their equipment, destroying their communication arrays and defensive positions. In the chaos that followed, James piloted the ship straight into the heart of their formation, its hull screaming with the strain. "Now!" Zara commanded. They triggered the emergency protocols they'd programmed into the ship's systems. The shadow field collapsed inward, creating a momentary bubble of null space that disoriented the Nexus forces. James and Zara jumped, their merged bioenergy fields protecting them as they hit the ground running. The beacon was still intact in the wreckage, its power signature calling to Zara like a beacon. But between them and their goal stood dozens of shadow troops, now recovering from their initial surprise. What followed was a dance of light and shadow. James and Zara moved in perfect synchronization, their shared abilities creating patterns of energy that disrupted the Nexus soldiers' coherence. Where once they had been hunter and healer, they had become something new, warriors whose very existence proved that different species could become stronger together. Above, the hijacked ship crashed as its systems overloaded, taking out another section of the Nexus forces. But more were coming. They could feel the massive ships descending through the atmosphere, carrying the main invasion force. They reached the beacon just as the first wave of reinforcements landed. The device was lodged in the ship's control room, partially melted into the console. "Cover me," Zara sent, her hands moving across the damaged controls. James turned to face the approaching shadow troops, his borrowed Lamini abilities flowing through him like liquid starlight. He didn't just fight them, he burned away their corruption with pure life force, each blast a reminder that some things couldn't be consumed or corrupted. Through their connection, he felt Zara's triumph as the beacon activated. Its signal shot skyward, carrying not just a call for help but a virus designed by the Resistance. Across the globe, hidden Nexus bases began to fail as their cloaking systems collapsed. Their infiltrators were exposed, their invasion plans laid bare for all to see. But the forces already on Earth weren't giving up. A massive shadow trooper, clearly a commander, broke through James's defenses. Its clawed hand wrapped around his throat, beginning to drain his life force. Zara's scream of rage echoed both audibly and mentally. She launched herself at the commander, her patterns blazing with accumulated power. The impact released all of their combined energy in a massive burst that rippled outward across the battlefield. Where it touched the shadow troops, something extraordinary happened. The corruption began to fade, revealing the original beings beneath, victims of the Nexus, now freed from their control. The commander itself collapsed, its shadow form dissolving to reveal a creature that looked almost like a Lumini. "They're not dead," Zara realized, helping James to his feet. "Just transformed. Like you were." The sky lit up with new arrivals, but these were Lumini ships, responding to the beacon's call. They engaged the remaining Nexus vessels as Earth's military forces, now aware of the threat, launched their own counterattack. James pulled Zara close as victory erupted around them. Their patterns synchronized one final time, not for battle but in celebration. Through their link, they shared not just thoughts but dreams of the future, one where humans and Lumini would work together to heal other victims of the Nexus, building something new from the ashes of invasion. "Stay with me?" James asked, this time with words rather than thoughts. Zara's response was to kiss him, her patterns lighting up with joy. Where their lips met, their energies merged once more, creating a display of light that rivaled the aurora above. The war wasn't over, there would be more battles, more challenges as Earth joined the larger galactic community. But in that moment, on a battlefield where shadow had given way to light, two beings from different worlds proved that love could bridge any distance, heal any wound, and light the way forward for both their peoples. Together, they had written a new chapter in the story of two species. And their light would shine on, a beacon of hope for all who followed.